No, the guy broke the law. And later on in the podcast, I'll tell you exactly what he said, and you can judge for yourself whether or not he said something hateful. But again, getting back to free speech in this country, we have unbelievable freedoms in this country. Yeah, we really do. We have more freedoms in this country than anywhere else in the world. Anywhere else in the world, especially when it comes to freedom of speech. And we have the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. Okay? And the number one Bill of Rights, the first one, the founders decided we needed to have. Okay, here's our Constitution. Now we need a Bill of Rights to really strengthen this Constitution. The very first one is freedom of speech and free press. In other words, you can say what you want to your buddy in a town hall, speaking with friends at the pub. And you need to have a press that can say whatever they want to say as well, just so you don't slander, of course. You can't slander somebody. You can't lie about them and say something that's wrong. If it's factual or opinionated, you can say it. And the rest of the amendments, and of course the Second Amendment, you hear it every time you turn on a radio or television. It's the right to keep and bear arms. Number 3, prevents government from forcing homeowners to allow soldiers into their home. Number 4, bars government from unreasonable search and seizure. Number 5, it protects people accused of crimes like self-incrimination. In other words, you hear these guys who are on trial, and they say, I plead the fifth. In other words, if they ask them, hey, did you steal that stack of gum from the candy store? If they really did, and they said yes, they would incriminate themselves. You have the freedom not to do that. You can just say, no, I'm not going to answer that question. Double jeopardy, that's another thing. You can only be tried for a crime once. Number 6, more protection for people accused of crimes like the right to a speedy trial, the right to an impartial jury. Number 7, it extends the rights to a jury trial in federal civil cases. Okay, just not criminal cases, but federal civil cases. You can have a jury trial as well. Number 8, bars excessive bail, fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. Number 9, constitutional rights are not finite. In other words, just because it's not here doesn't mean it doesn't apply. There are a lot of things that are assumed that are not in black and white in the Constitution. And number 10, the federal government only has powers designated in the Constitution. If they're not listed in the Constitution, then those powers can be enacted by the states or the people themselves, okay? But the number one, the first Bill of Rights, the first bill in the Bill of Rights is freedom of speech and freedom of the press, okay? We have that here in this country. And they don't necessarily have it other places, at least not like we have it here. I'll give you an example. Let's look at British law, okay? So much of our law is based on British common law. So much of it is, because that's where we came from. We were part of Britain some 250 years ago. We didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We kept a lot of what they did well, okay? But there's a British law called Section 5. And they're trying to reform Section 5 because of what it means and what it does. But it's a real law in the UK. Like I said, there's a campaign to remove the illegality of some of the things in Section 5. But basically, Section 5 says that it basically makes it illegal to speak words that are insulting or to have insulting behavior towards others. Well, you think to yourself, well, of course, you can't do that. Why would you want to do that? Well, consider this. In Britain, it's against the law to insult somebody or something. You cannot call them a name. Let me give you an example. A man in Britain was arrested for asking a police officer, do you realize that your horse is gay? Now, it's stupid to say that, but the man was arrested. Now, not because the officer was offended, but that there was a possibility that someone in the vicinity could have overheard that phrase and it could have offended them. The policeman arrested the man for saying that. It was actually a case of a teenager who was arrested for growling and barking at 2 dogs. The dogs could have been offended. True stories. There was a cafe owner who was arrested for showing biblical passages on a TV screen because some Bible passages may have offended some non-Christians. There was actually a LGBT group. They arrested the whole group. Why? because they were protesting anti-gay persecution in the Middle East. Think about why they were arrested. In the Middle East, in some Middle Eastern countries, if you're gay, they cut off your head. This LGBT group was protesting those laws in the Middle East, and they were arrested because some people who were of Middle Eastern descent and could have embraced those laws could have been offended. They really did arrest them. Okay? This is the UK. This is Great Britain. These are real laws. In fact, between 2001 and 2003, and those are the only statistics I could find, so I know they're older, but between those years of 2001 and 2003, over 51,000, in fact, 51,285 people were found guilty of violating Section 5 laws. Almost 8,500 of them were minors. In fact, there was a case where a 12-year-old boy was convicted of a Section 5 law because he called his teacher stupid. Folks, these are true laws. This is the way it is in the UK. In fact, I've told this story before on the podcast, but the trophy wife and I were traveling one time, and I think we were in Hong Kong coming home, and we were sitting next to in the airport a British resident who was talking about life back home. He was going to London. We were going to, I want to say Chicago or Los Angeles. I forget. On our way home, he too was on his way home. But the guy was very interesting and very drunk, but he was talking about politics in his country. And he was talking about the Liberal Party and how they were pieces of crap, and so was just a half-breed Indian who he didn't like. And I was talking smack about politics, okay, like people in this country do all the time. And there was a man who came up to him, another Brit, waving a finger in his face, saying, "You better get this out of your system, this hate speech, because you know that when you go back to the UK, if you talk like this, they will throw you in jail." And then he shook his finger in my face and said, "And you don't need to be embracing this. You're not even a Brit." And I said, "I'm not embracing anything. I'm listening to a man's conversation." I said, "Doesn't he have the right to speak his mind? And don't I have the right to listen to what he has to say?" And the gentleman said, "Here, maybe. In the UK, no. You would both be thrown in jail." I thought the guy was just a dope. But you know what? He was 100% right. And after he left, I asked the drunk Brit who was, making fun of the Liberal Party in the UK. He said, "Oh, no, he's absolutely right. I do need to get this out of the system, because if we were having this conversation in the London airport, they would throw us both in jail." I was just listening, and he was telling me, and that is a crime against Section 5 in the UK. Believe it or not. Research it. Don't believe me? Research it. Don't think anything that I have to say is truthful. Don't take it for gospel. Research it. Research Section 5 laws in the UK. Okay. In Canada, they have laws that are very, very similar. In fact, Section 1 of the Canadian Constitution gives Canadians the right to free speech, but with reasonable limitations. Well, of course we have reasonable limitations. We have reasonable limitations to free speech in this country, right? I mean, we have freedom of speech, but you can't slander somebody. You can't say something about them that's not true. You also can't yell fire in a crowded theater, so that's reasonable, right? The Canadian law is different, okay, because reasonable is opaque at best, okay? Again, this is the law from, I think, 1982, okay? Basically, the translation is that almost anything anyone says can be considered unconstitutional. In other words, can be considered against the law. Now, Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act prohibits communication of hate messages. There is zero tolerance. There are anti-bullying laws. But you think to yourself, well, of course, bullying is something wrong. You should never bully. Before you say that, consider how the Canadian law is written. Zero tolerance for all anti-bullying. That's the laws. Children can get expelled from school for saying something negative to their peers. Negative to their peers. Man, your hair looks bad today. That's kind of negative, isn't it? Children can be expelled from school for saying something negative to their peers. And schools can stalk students' Facebook accounts to find the evidence. In other words, if they really want to get rid of you, they can. There's another law in Canada. It was called Bill C-16, and it was enacted into law several years ago. And they added gender expression and gender identification to protected grounds, identity to protected grounds of the Canadian Human Rights Act. That was as of June 2017, okay? So about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Now the translation, failure to include an individual's preferred gender pronoun equals hate speech. Now again, on the surface, that seems fine. Calling a man a woman or a woman a man. That's what you think it means, right? No. In fact, what's wrong with that law? Calling a person by the gender that they want to be called by. Okay, if you were born a man and you now want to be called a woman, you demand to be called she, even though you were born a he, why not? Well, I will answer that question with a question. Remember, we're talking about gender-neutral pronouns here. Do you know how many gender-neutral pronouns are there? Oh, and by the way, it's not 2. It's 6. And if you conjugate them out, there are 30. 30 different gender-specific pronouns that people want to be called. 30. Oh, and by the way, of those 30, he and she are not included. Now, I'm not lying to you. These are people who want to be associated or affiliated with something other than a man or a woman, something else. And Canadian law says if that's what they want to be called, you better call them by that. If not, you violated the law. Now, I thought about going through the list, but I elected not to, mainly because I think the names are just silly. They're just silly. But in Canada, if you don't use them, there can be a big problem. In fact, while I was in Canada last week, I even watched a documentary on this. And it had a gender-neutral person who wanted to be referred to as, I don't even remember what it is, but it wasn't he or she. And they asked the question, well, what if people don't remember this? Well, this person basically said they need to be educated, they need to learn it, and if they mess up a time or two, that's fine because people are human and they can't remember everything every time. But if you purposely call me he and I want to be called je, that's hate speech. To me, that's silly. But by the way, if you're in Canada listening to this podcast, turn it down because just me saying that is against the law. Don't take my word for it. Ask Jordan Peterson. I've talked about Professor Peterson on this podcast many times. Very sharp guy. I love what he has to say. Clinical psychologist, and he's a professor at the University of Toronto. But Jordan Peterson refused to use those dopey pronouns. He said, no, I'm not going to use those pronouns. They're silly. They're ridiculous. He said, now, if you say you're not a man or a woman, I'll just refer to you as your name. If your name is Bill or Betty or Pete or Joe, I'll just call you by your name. And these people at the University of Toronto said, no, you must call me by the pronoun that I want to be called by. He said he's not going to do that. And he was reprimanded by the University of Toronto. By the way, Jordan Peterson is commonly called a white right-wing celebrity. But according to himself, he says, in other words, he identifies as a classic British liberal. And liberal meaning free thinker, thinking and doing things differently, not necessarily left-leaning. That type of liberal, okay? Which is very strange because he was chastised for not calling somebody by their gender-preferred pronoun, But people in Canada call him a right-wing celebrity. And he says, no, I'm not a right-wing celebrity. But that's